The world doesn't end in explosions. It ends when people stop seeing each other. Let us know in the comments section below. When you see someone sitting alone in silence, what do you imagine their story might be? The bell above the door jingled, sharp against the dull clatter of forks and ceramic. Evangeline didn't even need to look up. Table 7. He always came in at exactly 6:37 a.m., 2 minutes after the first batch of biscuits hit the window and precisely 13 minutes before the early lunch prep began. Punctual in a way that didn't feel rigid, just exact, deliberate. She filled a white mug with coffee, black, always black, and headed toward him without a word. She'd given up asking if he wanted cream or sugar a month ago. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then his words were the kind you leaned in to catch. Dry, short, never rude, like his voice was a room he didn't want visitors in. But Evangeline wasn't in the habit of avoiding locked doors. Not anymore. "You know," she said, setting the mug down with practiced ease, "you've got the same look my brother did when he got back from Kandahar. Like your body's here, but your mind's still packing sand." The man blinked slowly, his eyes shifting from the mug to her face. He didn't answer right away. She didn't mind. She was used to the tempo of grief. He looked like he'd been chewed up and spat out by the world. Weathered. Not old, but aged in the way rust sneaks into iron. There was always a dull ring where his wedding band used to sit. His hands were broad and worn, and he sat like someone expecting the floor to give way at any second. "You talk too much," he finally murmured, not unkindly. Evangeline cracked a smile. "You think that's bad? You should hear me sing." Something flickered in his expression. Not a smile, not really, but something less hollow. She glanced at the badge on his worn jacket. Rivers. No first name, no rank. Just a surname that sounded more like a direction than an identity. When he didn't elaborate, she nodded once and returned to the counter, already thinking of the fresh pot she'd need by the time the church crowd trickled in. She didn't see Officer Rick Hanley walk in, but she heard him. "Coffee, none of that burnt stuff," he said, rapping the counter with his knuckles like he owned the damn building. Evangeline turned slowly. Hanley was always a little too loud, a little too smug in his uniform. Miller's Diner had 3 unwritten rules. Don't rush the biscuits, tip fair, and don't mess with Evangeline. Hanley liked to bend all 3. "Morning, Rick," she said flatly, already reaching for the pot he hated just to spite him. "The burnt stuff's all we got." He gave her that crooked smirk that never touched his eyes. Then he spotted Rivers. Hanley tilted his head. "That the guy that's been sitting over there all week?" Evangeline didn't answer. Her silence was the kind that said yes without permission. "What's his story?" Hanley asked, leaning in, suddenly real interested. "He look familiar to you?" She didn't look up. "He's quiet, that's his story." Hanley chuckled. "Too quiet. Makes a man wonder what he's hiding." Evangeline's spine straightened. "Some people are just tired, Rick. Doesn't mean they've done anything wrong. It doesn't mean they haven't either." She hated the way he said it, like it was bait he dangled, waiting for her to bite. "You want coffee or questions?" she asked. "Because you're only getting one today." The cop narrowed his eyes at her, then sauntered off to the stool closest to the window. He'd wait. He always did. Wait for a moment when he could poke, prod, and dig. Authority gave men like him excuses. And she was growing real tired of excuses. An hour passed. More customers came and went. Line cooks shouted orders, the jukebox stuttered out a familiar Patsy Cline tune, and the bell on the front door sang its 1,000th note. Rivers said nothing, ate slow, tipped well. At one point, a kid in a scout uniform dropped a napkin, and Rivers bent down to hand it back, his movements careful, like his limbs remembered something he didn't want to. Evangeline watched, not because she was suspicious, because she was worried. She refilled his mug once more, pausing longer than she should have. "You okay?" she asked quietly. He looked up at her like the question had weight, like no one had asked it in a long time. "No," he said, "but that's fine." She blinked. It was the most he'd ever said. When she turned away, she saw Hanley rise. "Of course." "Mr. Rivers," Hanley said, his voice artificially polite, "mind stepping outside with me for a minute?" Evangeline set the coffee pot down too hard. The crack echoed. Rivers didn't flinch. He stood slowly. No tension in his shoulders. Just that same watchful stillness, like he was back in a combat zone and everything outside the door was tripwired. "Why?" Evangeline asked, stepping between them before Rivers could move. Hanley raised a brow. "Just need to ask him a few questions." "Not in front of breakfast." "Is he under arrest?" "No." "Then he can stay right there." Now Hanley's smile slipped. "Evie, don't get in the middle of this." "I'm not in the middle," she said, eyes locked on his. "I'm standing beside him." That did it. The tension bloomed fast. Customers pausing mid-bite. The cook peeking out from the kitchen. Rivers put a hand lightly on her shoulder. "It's all right," he said, voice calm. "I've been through worse." But that wasn't the point. It wasn't all right. And Evangeline Newman had never been the kind of woman to step aside when something wasn't right. What she didn't know was how much that moment would change everything. What she didn't see, what no one did, was the convoy of army jeeps already winding through the next county road, kicking up dust and silence in equal measure. And they were coming for her. When Evangeline got home that night, her apron still dusted with flour and bacon grease, she couldn't shake the look on Rivers's face when he told her, "I've been through worse." It wasn't sadness she'd seen in his eyes. It was weariness, the kind that sat low in the bones, the kind that made you look like a ghost in your own skin. She dropped her keys in the chipped dish on the entryway table, kicked off her shoes, and sank into the couch without turning the light on. The diner's noise still clung to her like smoke. Plates clattering, boots scuffing, Hanley's smug voice echoing like a splinter in the air. She replayed it all. How Rivers hadn't hesitated to follow him outside, how Hanley had walked just a little too close behind him, how the bell above the door had sounded like a warning instead of a goodbye. And she'd just watched him go. She scrubbed her hands over her face, then stood and walked to the kitchen. Her old rescue mutt, Daisy, looked up from her blanket, tail thumping once in greeting. Evangeline gave her a tired smile, scratched behind her ears, and grabbed a beer from the fridge. The bottle hissed when she opened it, a silence more honest than anything spoken all day. She'd seen people get brushed aside before, veterans mostly, men and women who'd been loud once, proud, brave, whole, then came back quiet and haunted, limping through a system that didn't know what to do with them. She remembered her brother Eli drinking himself to sleep on her couch 6 months after discharge, the ghost of a war still lingering in his ribs. Rivers had that same ache behind his eyes. And it wasn't just Hanley, it was the town. Millbrook had a way of pulling its curtains shut around anything unfamiliar, too small to stay anonymous, too proud to ask questions. People whispered. It didn't matter what the truth was. Once a story made it to the post office steps, it might as well have been scripture. The next morning proved it. She walked into the diner 15 minutes early, apron tied, hair pinned, and a knot already sitting in her chest. By 7:30, the whispers were louder than the coffee machine. "Did you hear about that man Evie stood up for? I always thought he looked off. Maybe he's one of those PTSD types, you know how they are. I heard he was arrested. Saw Hanley take him away myself. Suspicious types never stay long. Not once the right people start asking questions." Evangeline kept her jaw tight, her head down. Poured coffee, cleared plates, smiled like she didn't hear a thing. But by the time Miss Adeline left her booth, the one she'd occupied every Tuesday for 30 years, The older woman leaned over the counter and whispered with a half-pity, half-mournful voice, "Careful who you defend, child. People are watching." Evangeline just stared back. Good. Maybe they'll finally see something worth looking at. Rivers didn't show up that morning, or the next. By Thursday, the booth sat empty and the town's curiosity had turned sour. Even the regulars stopped meeting her eyes when they placed their orders. That afternoon, Evangeline found herself staring out the front window between shifts. Her hands were still, but her mind churned. Something wasn't right. Hanley hadn't said anything when he came in for coffee the day before. He just gave her a smug little nod and left exact change, which was worse than any insult. Then she noticed it. Across the street, parked half in shadow, was a government sedan. No plates. Tinted windows. Unmoving. The kind you don't see unless you're looking for it. She blinked. Heart thudding once, then shook it off. Maybe she was being paranoid. Maybe. The bell above the door rang. 3 men entered. They weren't locals. 2 of them wore suits, straight-backed and stiff, like their collars were too tight. The third wore a fatigue jacket, old, not parade neat, but clean. There were creases at his eyes that said he'd smiled once, probably in another lifetime. Evangeline straightened instinctively, the coffee pot in her hand forgotten. The man in the jacket stepped forward. His voice, when it came, was low and clear. "Looking for a Miss Evangeline Newman?" She blinked. "You found her." He gave a respectful nod. "Colonel James Whitmore, United States Army. These men are with me." The entire diner had gone silent. Forks paused mid-bite. Even the jukebox seemed to stall. "What can I help you with?" Whitmore reached into his jacket slowly, like he knew sudden movements would only add weight to the moment. He pulled out a small, velvet-lined box and a letter. "This was meant for you." She didn't move. He placed the box on the counter between them. "For your kindness." The air around her thinned. She opened the box. A silver star? Not replica, real, cleaned, preserved, gleaming in the morning light like a wound-turn badge. She looked at Whitmore, lips parted but soundless. "Dan Rivers," he said, gently, "is not missing. He's safe. And very much alive." A breath left her lungs she didn't know she'd been holding. "He asked me to bring this," Whitmore continued, unfolding the letter and sliding it forward, "and to say thank you." Evangeline picked it up with shaking hands. The script was neat, tight, like the man himself. "Evangeline, I never expected kindness, least of all from someone with fire in her spine and dirt under her nails. You didn't owe me anything, but you gave something anyway. That kind of courage, it reminds men like me that there's still a reason to stay alive, that there's still a home worth protecting. Thank you for seeing me." But when she looked up, her eyes were wet and unashamed. Whitmore was watching her like a man who'd seen soldiers bury brothers. "You knew him?" she asked softly. "Served with him, long time ago. Hell of a man. Walked away from a lot, but never forgot where he came from." She nodded once, then twice, grounding herself. As she turned to the booth by the window, to every customer now, pretending not to stare. "Everyone talking like they know something," she said, voice cutting through the hum of silence. "You might want to remember what a silver star means before you speak another word." The room held its breath. Then Whitmore smiled, slow and approving. "I think he was right about you," he said. Evangeline exhaled, the weight of the letter pressing into her chest like armor. She looked outside again. The sedan was gone, but the jeeps were coming. The backlash didn't come in shouts. It came in silence. The kind of silence that stretches across sidewalks like oil on water. It lingered in the aisles of the grocery store where folks who'd once chatted about pie crusts and fishing weather now turned away like Evangeline's presence might stain them. It filled the pews at Sunday service when the Reverend spoke of grace and no one looked in her direction. not even during the benediction. Her act of kindness had turned the town's gaze into a jury box. It started small. Cora, who ran the local print shop, no longer gave her the usual discount when she picked up the monthly diner flyers. "New policy," she muttered without eye contact. It didn't matter that the man she'd defended was now a confirmed veteran, one who'd earned a silver star. To some folks, facts didn't matter once gossip hardened into belief. Then it escalated. Miller, the diner's owner, pulled her aside that Monday morning, his face drawn and voice apologetic in that way men get when they've already made a decision. "Evie, look, business is slowing, people talking. Some customers are saying they won't come back if things don't quiet down." She stared at him, flour still dusting her forearms from the biscuit prep, her eyes unblinking. "You're saying I did something wrong?" He shook his head too fast. No, nothing like that. But people, they're uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people don't tip." He didn't answer. He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding her eyes. "Just take the rest of the week, paid of course, let things settle." "You want me gone?" she said flatly. "I want the place to survive," he said, then added too softly, "and I want you safe." Evangeline walked home that day with a weight in her chest that felt heavier than shame. It wasn't shame, it was anger, a slow, burning coal that glowed behind her ribs. When she reached her porch, she saw it, nailed to her door, a flyer, cheap paper, grainy ink, a blurred photo of Dan Rivers leading the diner with her. Across it, typed in block letters, "Gaina U, here serving." No signature, no return address, just cowardice and toner. She tore it down without flinching, hands steady. Her dog Daisy barked twice from inside, sensing her shift in mood. But night she didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at her kitchen table, the silver star still in its velvet box, Dan's letter beside it, and she began to write. Not a journal, not a complaint, a statement. Her story. She wrote about her father, a veteran of Desert Storm who came home different, about her brother Eli, who took his own life 3 years ago, and how no one had asked why. She wrote about Dan Rivers, how he never asked for anything, not even a refill, how he moved like a man who didn't want to take up space, how people only started caring when a badge walked in and told them to. She wrote until the sun broke the horizon, warming the paper with light that didn't feel earned. And then she posted it to the diner's community board, on the town's Facebook group, on every telephone pole within 6 blocks. No commentary, no hashtags, just her name, and her words. By noon, half the town had seen it. By evening, the other half had formed an opinion. Some folks nodded at her in the market, unsure whether to speak or stay quiet. A few slipped notes under her porch railing, unsigned but kind. Others scoffed out loud in front of her, muttering about wokeness and bleeding hearts. One man spit on the sidewalk near her boots and kept walking. She didn't flinch. She showed up at the diner anyway, even when Miller looked surprised to see her. "You told me to take the week off," she said. "You didn't tell me I couldn't eat here." He just nodded, then poured her coffee without charging her. The next day, a woman she didn't know came in and sat at table 7. "I read your letter," she said quietly. "My brother, he didn't make it back from Fallujah, but if he had, I hope someone like you would have been here for him." Evangeline didn't cry. She only nodded, her throat thick. Then came the second man. Then a couple. Then a young teen in a hoodie who left a single folded dollar bill on the table and walked out without ordering. By Wednesday, someone had scrubbed the flyer residue off her door. A new one had gone up. "Support your neighbor. Respect your veterans." It wasn't signed either, but it didn't need to be. Still, not everyone was pleased. Henley was less than subtle when he came into the diner that Friday, his badge glinting like a challenge. He leaned on the counter, arms folded, voice too casual. You're stirring things up, Evie. She didn't stop wiping the counter. Maybe they needed stirring. People forget who keeps them safe. She looked up, eyes sharp. That badge on your chest? Or the medals you never earned? The diner went silent again. Hanley's mouth twitched. Not a smile, something darker. You know, he said slowly, sometimes good intentions end up putting people in danger. You might have made things harder for that friend of yours. You don't even know his name, she replied, her voice cold steel. I know enough to know he's being watched. Can't have someone like that just vanishing off-grid, right? Her heart jumped, but she didn't show it. He's not the one hiding, she said. He leaned closer, voice dropping low. You should be careful, Evangeline. The army might be watching now, but they won't stay forever. Then he turned and walked out, and she was left with a fresh weight, not fear, but fire, because she knew then something wasn't finished. Dan hadn't just left town quietly. Something had happened after that morning, and Hanley knew more than he let on. The next move wasn't hers. It was his, and it was coming soon. It happened on a Tuesday. Miller's Diner had just opened its doors when the first Jeep rolled into town, rumbling over the cracked pavement with quiet authority. Not loud, not ostentatious, just steady, like the sound of truth arriving on its own terms. Evangeline was behind the counter pouring the first pot of coffee when the second Jeep pulled in behind the first, then a third, then a fourth. Not a parade, not a convoy. Something quieter and more deliberate. Olive-drab paint, government plates, dust on the tires from somewhere far older than this sleepy town. The bell over the door chimed. She looked up and froze. Colonel Whitmore stepped in first, hat tucked under his arm. Behind him, 3 men and 2 women in uniform. None of them young, none of them uncertain. They scanned the room like soldiers do, assessing exits, noting faces. But not in suspicion, in protection. Whitmore nodded once at her. I'd like to make. Mr. Newman, he said, good morning. She didn't speak right away. The diner had gone quiet again. Not from fear this time, from awe. Colonel, she said finally, didn't expect company. He glanced at the others behind him. You earned it. Then, as if on cue, the Jeep's back doors opened, and out stepped Daniel Rivers. He looked cleaner than he had, a little more rested, but the same. That same weight in his posture, the same cautious eyes. Only this time there was something else. Gratitude, not the clumsy, mumbled kind, the kind that settled in the lines of a man's face and didn't leave. He stepped into the diner, and every fork paused mid-air. He walked past booth 5, past the sugar station, straight to table 7, and he sat down. Evangeline stepped around the counter, coffee pot forgotten, hands wringing her apron. You're back, she said quietly. Rivers nodded once. Didn't want to be. Had to be. She sat across from him before she realized she'd moved. You all right? She asked. He hesitated, then, yeah. He slid a folded piece of paper across the table. She didn't reach for it, just watched his face. What is it? He glanced out the window toward the Jeeps. Vindication, he said, maybe a little justice. She finally opened it. It wasn't a letter this time. It was a report. Official. Signed and sealed. She didn't understand half the acronyms, but the parts she did made her blood run cold. Misconduct within Millbrook Police Department, unauthorized civilian surveillance, obstruction of Veterans Affairs investigation, collusion with private contractors. Target? Daniel Rivers. Her fingers tightened on the paper. Badly. Rivers nodded. I'd been helping some guys. Old contacts, ex-military. We were tracking a shell operation that was skimming VA benefits off fake accounts. Hanley was the local point of contact for one of their informants. I'd traced part of the flow back to Millbrook, but the second I showed my face in town, he flagged you. Yeah, he knew I couldn't go public, not without backup, so he tried to make me disappear. Evangeline stared at him, every inch of her coiled tight. And when I stood up for you, I became a problem too. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and his voice softened. You became the reason I made it out. Outside, another Jeep rolled up. This one was different. Painted white, marked with the seal of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Whitmore straightened and opened the diner door. Two men in suits stepped out and walked toward the building with purpose. One of them held a file, the other held handcuffs. Hanley never made it past the first step. He'd pulled up out front, still in uniform, still smug, still certain the game was his to play, until the VA agent stepped forward. Officer Richard Hanley? He frowned. Yeah, what is this? Filled with invigoration for federal misconduct. You'll need to come with us. The silence in the diner turned into something sharper. Gasps, a few claps. One old man near the window just muttered, "About damn time." Hanley's face reddened. This is ridiculous. What proof do you even have? Whitmore stepped forward then, tall and immovable. We have it all. You've been leaking intelligence, blocking federal oversight, targeting veterans for personal gain. Hanley's jaw flexed. He looked toward the diner, toward Evangeline, and the sneer returned. This is her doing. Evangeline stood. No, she said, her voice calm and clear. This is your doing. I just refuse to let you hide it. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists, and as the Jeep doors shut behind him, the town exhaled. It wasn't loud, no cheers, no parade, but something shifted. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the streets grew quiet, Evangeline unlocked the door to the diner again. She wasn't supposed to work the night shift, but tonight wasn't about work. It was about something else. The door opened, and one by one they came in. Veterans, families, townspeople who'd been watching from the shadows, waiting for someone to break the silence. They filled the booths, not with orders, with stories. A man with tremors from the Gulf War shook her hand and said, "I didn't think anyone cared anymore." A woman who'd lost her husband in Iraq brought in a photo album and left it on the community table. Someone put a jar on the counter with a handwritten sign, "For Dan," for all of them. By midnight it was full. Daniel Rivers stayed at table 7. He didn't say much, just listened, watched, smiled once, when a little girl drew him a picture of an American flag with his name written above it in shaky crayon. Evangeline brought him a fresh cup of coffee. This place is never going to be the same, you know. He looked around. Good. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out something small and wrapped in cloth. He slid it across the table. She opened it slowly. Dog tags. His bent at the edges, smudged with time. "For you," he said simply. She stared at them. "I can't take these." "You already did," he said, "the second you saw me." She didn't cry. Not then. Not when he stood and hugged her. Not even when he whispered, "Thank you for giving me a reason to come back." But when he left, when the door swung shut and the bell rang like a final chord, she held those dog tags in her hand and let herself feel it all. Outside, the jeeps drove off into the night, their lights fading down Main Street. Inside, the diner stayed warm, and for the first time in a long time, Millbrook felt like a town that remembered how to see its heroes. Evangeline tucked the tags into her apron pocket, wiped the counter clean, and turned the sign in the window from closed to open. Because now it truly was